At CBE Exchange again this year. It's great to be in person. I'm Jim Hermans. I'm the CEO of Region Education, and we're honored and privileged to once again participate as a sponsor with CBEN, be in person at Amelia Island, and most importantly for this presentation today, record it so that many of our virtual attendees who couldn't join us in Florida can participate. I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing the impact of financial aid regulations on your CBE program scalability. Discussing the various options that you have around managing financial aid awarding that can maximize your institutional objectives for your CBE programs, especially as they are growing and expanding. I want to apologize up front. I'm co-presenting this at Amelia Island with Kelly Running, who is the Director of Financial Aid Systems at Capella University. And Kelly, because of pre-existing travel commitments, was unable this week prior to the conference to record this with us. I'm going to do my best to cover the several slides that really are hers and Capella's. Capella University is one of the leading providers of competency-based education in the country to provide. But I'll just remind, please follow up with any questions that emerge from this. Contact either one of us after the session, and I know both Kelly and I are more than happy to support that. And I look forward to seeing Kelly in person in Amelia Island for our in-person session. So the reason why this topic is important and critically important, we believe, to institutions that are choosing to implement CBE, choosing to scale and really invest in their CBE programs and obviously grow their enrollments, has to do with the very data that comes out of the CBE community in the biannual CBEN survey. In this survey, consistently, we've seen feedback that financial aid and existing business systems and processes are some of the greatest barriers to actually growing and scaling your CBE programs. The number one and number two factors directly related. Number one, that the existing business systems and processes within institutions hinder the growth and scalability of CBE. And number two, that the federal student aid awarding regulations and processes affect this. And clearly, at Region Education, as a software provider to partners in higher education, we believe these two things are inextricably linked, that your business systems and processes should form a foundation for how you can manage your options, optimize your options around enrollment and financial aid. So we want to recognize that this is critical relative to choices and potentially investments and processes that can drive CBE growth and scale. So really, it goes back to this question, very, very simple. We call this like the Friday afternoon question. If your president or provost asks you to grow, scale, invest in your CBE program, could you do it? Are you able to, from a financial aid, and therefore in the number one question and answer, business process standpoint, really have the systems in place that could allow that CBE system to grow to your initial 100, to your 500, to your 1500th enrollment within an operating year. And that's why we think it's critical, given this feedback that has come out of the community, to discuss the options that exist for financial aid awarding that support CBE program growth. So we're going to spend a minute describing the various options that exist for financial aid awarding. We're then going to do a comparison of how those options actually relate to both your institutional objectives, make sure there's some reflection on what are you trying to achieve as your colleges and universities and other programmatic efforts grow CBE enrollments, as well as what the impact is on your business systems and processes. And then we'll discuss a little bit how Capella made their choices to implement particular financial aid models over their history of tens of thousands of enrollments in their FlexPath program. And then Kelly and I have a little bit of advice on sort of three things to remember as you make these choices around financial aid models for your CBE programs. So three basic models approved by the Department of Education can support the way in which you might approach financial aid awarding, Title IV awarding to your students who are eligible within your CBE programs, term, non-term, and since 2021, the brand new Department of Education approved subscription model, which we will spend a little bit more time discussing the subscription period model with some degree of detail. But let me first give a basic background on what these three models, what their differences are, how they might apply to your choices around financial aid awarding for your CBE programs. And again, we will do a comparison of them relative to your priorities within your institution and the business process impact. So standard type term, what is term? Term defines enrollments and the awarding of financial aid within structured term periods that the accumulation of which defines your academic year. Fall term, spring term, and optional summer, potentially shorter terms, fall, winter, spring, and an optional summer. Those are the traditions, or in fact, in a flexible start program, it could still be term 1, term 2 with different start dates. Some comments about term structure relative to financial aid. Number one, this can impact your awarding of self-paced and constrain your self-paced learning within a competency-based model. And therefore, given that constraint and possible flexibilities you want in a competency-based model, there can be implications on financial aid. So for instance, specifically, there is a direct regulatory limit to whether or not a course enrollment that a student's in within a term can extend beyond the end date of that term. Now, there is some flexibility, but at the end of the day, there are some real limits to whether a course enrollment can progress beyond that term. Some of those limits include the necessity to limit a student from starting a new course within X number of weeks of finishing one when a course was still enrolled or still being completed. It's possible if a student has not yet completed previous coursework within a competency-based model to allow new courses to begin, but assign grades associated with incompletes or partial completions at the end of a term. You may need to actually re-register for a pre-existing course in the new term, which has a direct impact on the number of courses that a student's enrolled in and their appropriate financial aid awarding. There can be use. Regulatory statute allows for this. You can assign incompletes as a term ends and previous coursework is not fully completed. However, financial aid regulation also requires that be done on an exception basis. So it can't be a practice that is applying to your management of how you're awarding financial aid broadly across all your students enrolled in a term-based competency program. And then there are some opportunities to potentially start a course earlier. But again, if one course is still progressing within a previous term and you start a new terms course, that creates overlap of those courses assigned to different terms, which is not allowed and will prevent your awarding of financial aid. So that's a little primer on how term would work relative to an enrollment within a term and the financial aid considerations around it. A second model is non-term, and a colleague of mine likes to say, simply put, there are no terms. So there is no structured term in which a student is enrolled. Merely courses overlap and can continue consecutively, overlap, be sequential without any term structures that those courses are progressing against. And this is a highly flexible way to allow an individual to enroll in one or multiple courses that can have different pace over time for progression towards completion. When such a highly flexible model is utilized, the payment periods for financial aid are based on a calculation of half the units and weeks that you would normally complete for your academic year, defining the basic payment periods within an academic year. But it's important to note then that given those 50% of your units to 100% of units within the academic year, that academic year does not need to be 365 days long. A non-term academic year can be shorter and it can be longer based on student completion and the progression associated with their coursework and their completion of that coursework. And therefore, it is critical to measure your payments, your financial aid payments out to students based upon their progress, because the student progress completion to half or 100% of their expected units against a full-time enrollment is going to determine when financial aid payments, disbursements can actually be made. So this provides an incredible amount of flexibility, but there are some challenges associated with non-term. So number one is, how do you track? How do you track what that academic progression is that translates into the appropriate points for financial aid awarding? Number two, you likely have, if you have structured your enrollment models to support incoming transfer students, the need to actually map partial completion from a previous institution into a non-term structure for that greater flexibility. And then a third limitation that we often hear from institutions is, well, I would like the payments to my students, the payment periods for financial aid, to match my billing periods. I want the ability to actually have the student to anticipate when they'll receive Title IV and when they will receive the invoice from student accounts, so that we can most appropriately align their incoming funds with their educational expenses. And obviously, if the payment periods are based upon highly flexible student progression, unless you delay your billing periods, which becomes one of those operational challenges, that can create a limitation or another challenge around non-term. And last, let me summarize subscription period. A new model from the Department of Ed, an incredibly exciting model, we believe, and in fact, the first new authorized awarding model for Title IV financial aid in what we estimate is somewhere around a decade and a half, actually authorizing a brand new model of student completion that defines when you can actually pay financial aid. So first, we'd highlight that the subscription period model really creates no impediments to student flexibility. You can structure your enrollments and your financial aid awarding and your payments out to students and invoicing based on your existing term structure, but the student has incredible flexibility as far as how course completion takes place across those. If a student addresses those courses within their terms faster, they could graduate sooner, they could complete sooner. They would, in fact, trip less subscription period, a term-based invoices, and therefore they could actually accomplish their degree or programmatic endpoint faster at lower total overall cost, potentially overall financial aid borrowing and other financial aid awarding. So the rules around subscription period invoicing is that you bill your tuition and your enrollment at a flat rate per period, per the term. You can charge on a yearly basis or on a term basis within the year, but you charge a flat rate for essentially all the student can consume in terms of course progression during that time period. Originally, you mentioned this next point, that these programs were originally structured just for direct assessment educational methodology for competency-based. No longer. Subscription period model is authorized for a flexible model that's not using direct assessment against competencies for student progression measurement. It can be structured in terms of courses, other learning equivalents, etc. Contra to the term-based model, a student can pick a variety of enrollment levels, typically full-time or half-time, that is their targeted progression rate as far as how fast they're going to move through their overall enrollment level. So if you're 12 credits per term, they could choose a target of 12 or a target of 6, which is going to determine your measurement of their progression actually through their financial aid windows and therefore their associated awarding levels within financial aid. And the basic model for subscription period in the calculations assumes that the student will complete at their assumed enrollment level. So there's a measurement taking place of the student progression based on that assumed enrollment level. A couple of other points then as far as how financial aid is awarded. So you award, one of the attractive points of this model is you award financial aid just as if the student were in a term-based enrollment. So if you're charging invoicing on a term basis for the subscription period, all you can eat, those are the disbursement points for financial aid as well. However, this model affords the flexibility that courses can overlap. A course can move from one term to another in terms of completion. Some courses could accelerate and be completed earlier if it's self-paced. Some could extend further if it's self-paced. Or term enrollments can take place sequentially based on the student's progression. So it doesn't matter when your term dates start and end relative to when courses start and end. So the measurement of when disbursements are actually made is judged upon the student's completion for the required units from the previous enrollment periods. However, there is a considerable amount of flexibility relative to that subscription period measurement. It looks at the previous two academic years. And so therefore, a student is expected to progress at their subscription period rate, full-time or half-time, but they can slow down or speed up. In later periods, after their first two enrollment periods, the measurement will continue to look at whether the student's completing at the appropriate and expected time and can adjust the financial aid awarding over that time period. And one of the challenges we'll just highlight, there are limits on whether the student can move between a full-time assumption and a half-time assumption, but that is allowed. But there are limits on how often that can actually take place. So one of the challenges is just ensuring that the student is choosing the right enrollment level for their expectation. Let's just spend a second here on institutional priorities and how they map to these three basic models, as well as business process impact across these three models. I'll highlight several of these. So first, flexible scheduling. If your objectives institutionally are to drive to incredible flexibility for your students, to allow them to choose the pace and potentially accelerate the pace at which they're completing, well, the non-term and subscription period will offer the greatest degree of flexibility and therefore meet those institutional objectives. In terms of minimizing student debt, one can minimize student debt by completing earlier, and hence non-term and subscription period can both contribute to that. However, a reminder, if a student slows down in non-term, hence 2X's here, their financial aid awarding, their indebtedness, their loans can slow down as well. Whereas in the subscription period, there is a period of time where they do not yet slow down because of that catch-up measurement taking place within their overall awarding. If your objective is to maintain your current billing system to bill on term-based dates, well, then both the term model, although giving up the flexibility, and the subscription period model can support that. A billing in a non-term model must reflect the pace and the progression which a student is completing. Can you award these models with a traditional financial aid management system, a FAM? Well, typically with a term-based model or a subscription period, you could. However, disbursing appropriately and compliantly the right dollar amount on the right date becomes problematic in a term-based model, simply because you do have recalculations that have to take place based on student progression. So while that could take place, there are some real limits on the ability to do so, and therefore a subscription period model cannot utilize a traditional, or sorry, I should also highlight a non-term model cannot utilize a traditional financial aid management system, which is not equipped to actually flexibly adjust those disbursement dates within your financial aid awarding. Thanks, sorry for the interruption. In terms of implementation considerations, there are a range of operational considerations. So if one is looking for automating the payment period structure, again, back to your relationship between the student's enrollment and your invoicing, well, non-term is going to have the most significant impact because your payment periods out to your students for financial aid can flex considerably with non-term. As I mentioned, an an academic year is not 365 days, it is entirely upon student progression. In terms of automating disbursement and compliant eligibility tracking, both the non-term model and the subscription period model require measurement of that flexible progression for the student, and therefore, once again, a larger impact on potential operations. Do you need to inform your student about when the next disbursement will take place and what units need to be completed? In a term-based model, as long as courses are being completed within that term, no. In a non-term and subscription period model, we believe it's critical that students understand what their completion targets are to actually receive those payments back. However, where are the operational implications for term? If your courses, if you try to enable flexible enrollment courses within a term-based model, they cannot overlap the next term. There is a little bit of flexibility around the exact date, but by and large, they cannot overlap the term start dates. And we mentioned the use of incompletes earlier, but there's a large operational impact here to actually define what level of flexibility is possible within a term-based structure. The greatest ability to align your billing and billing periods and financial aid is going to be through a term or subscription period model, because those dates are going to be constant. In a non-term model, not the same. The one reason why there's a single check under the subscription period model is based upon the fact that there are measurements of that student progression over time that can adjust actually how much can be paid at those term start dates within your financial aid model. And there's clearly, in a brand new model, whether it's non-term or subscription period that you might be embracing, there will be simply a larger training and informational effort for your staff and your students as you progress. As I mentioned, let me do my best to summarize how our partners at Strategic Education and Capella University chose to enable their competency-based program, and how they've modified that approach over time. Capella University's flexible competency-based program is called FlexPath. It is marketed and positioned as one that allows a student to progress at their pace flexibly over time. And Capella traditionally allows the students to choose whether they want to be in a traditional term-based structure or a self-paced structure. And they do allow the students some rubrics and some tools to help choose which model is going to be best for them. So Capella's flexible competency-based model is one of the leading competency-based models in the country. Originally, Capella started with a term-based approach, and that was simply because of other limitations around their operational systems. They very quickly moved to a non-term model to drive additional student flexibility. Most recently, in the fall of 2022, with capabilities around the Department of Ed's new subscription period model and our system support within Regent, they've moved to a new subscription period model for their newest enrollments, so that the subscription periods and the financial aid awarding could align with their billing periods, as non-term did not. And then there's a range of ways in which they've automated financial aid processes utilizing some of our tools, as well as adopted student-specific information within their portal to support the student's progression and life cycle. FlexPath has been by and large a success for Capella. There have been over 20,000 FlexPath graduates over time in the past roughly 7 years that enrollments have been taking place. It now represents over 30% of Capella's total enrollment in the last several years, driving a significant number of students across a range of Capella programs, most recently expanding to 3 different doctoral programs as well that are within the FlexPath structure. And the program is consistently generating in the neighborhood of $65+ million in annual financial aid disbursements in these enrollments that are taking place in FlexPath. As I mentioned, initially non-term was chosen. So a pilot was done on term, but that was chosen after the pilot to not afford enough flexibility. And so the operational challenges, as we mentioned earlier, the Capella faced were very much around whether a course could end and be successfully completed by term end, and they wanted additional flexibility to extend beyond structured term dates. So the movement was to an effort of non-term to allow considerable flexibility around enrollments and payment periods for their students, a maximum flexibility of their academic model, maximum flexibility and measurement of their financial aid awarding. And then they utilized a range of both legacy business systems as well as new business systems, such as an investment in Regent education, to support that financial aid awarding. Now, most recently, as I mentioned, fall of 2022, Capella has moved to phase in the subscription period model. First, the non-term assumptions about student progression are based upon a full-time expectation. And so any students that wanted to progress at a slower rate had longer delays to their next financial aid disbursement. So in order to maximize flexibility within a financial aid program and not see these rigid progression rules affect things like persistence or payment expectations of financial aid, that was considered one of the weaknesses of the non-term model. Whereas the subscription period program for Capella really allows a considerable increase in flexibility. It allows full-time, part-time assumptions, other models can be assumed. And as we mentioned, the ability for a student to change across those models in a limited number of times. But nevertheless, that is entirely possible. We would call them softened disbursement requirements, meaning these are measured over time relative to student progression. Up front, as we mentioned here, particularly with regard to the most recent term, they are softened. So a student has some ability to anticipate if their slowdown is going to impact a future disbursement of financial aid, and commensurately has the ability to catch up and speed up and stay on a regular financial aid disbursement schedule within the subscription period model. Now, the term-based billing structure is easy to understand. The billing and payment periods are known operationally internally, they're known operationally to the students, and so that creates a great degree of transparency and consistent expectations between financial aid and the actual billing period. And I will note, I think the community should acknowledge as well that Capella's participation is directly related to their contributions to being a contributor to the negotiated rulemaking for subscription period model that took place in 20 and 21 before the Department of Education announced them fully and embraced them. So Capella has been an early proponent of such a flexible model and helped craft many of the inputs that went into the department to allow this kind of flexible model to exist. So they are, effectively putting their money where their mouth is as far as believing in the efficacy and the value of such a flexible program. So that hopefully gives you a little evolution as to how these models exist, how Capella embraced initially non-term after pilot, has migrated to subscription period, driving tens of thousands of enrollments and graduates, tens of millions of dollars a year in financial aid disbursements, supported by a financial aid system in a region that affords a considerable level of automation and flexibility around measuring the progression and the disbursement periods. So we put our heads together to think about what are 3 recommendations we would make to the CBE community as you think about marrying up a financial aid model with your CBE objectives. So there's 3. And I wish Kelly were here to sort of comment on each of these, because she's really the expert in giving this level of advice. But I'll remind, number one, involve financial aid, your peers and your colleagues in financial aid, in your pre-launch process planning for competency-based modeling. How flexible do you want to be? Where do you want that flexibility to exist? Do you want flexibility across course progression that's considerably flexible? And therefore, that is a decision point. Again, back to institutional priorities, and financial aid should be involved in helping support that operationally. Number 2, discuss then openly up front, given those decisions, what financial aid models can exist. And we would emphasize, recognize that this brand new subscription period model is a fundamentally new tool in your toolbox to enable highly flexible enrollments while still utilizing existing business process capabilities, schedule, norms, billing periods within an existing term structure. And then finally, if you want to support scalability, automation is critical. If every student must be measured for progression, if that progression relates to whether you can appropriately disperse compliantly, automation is critical to then allow your CBE initiative to scale and grow significantly over time. So 3 recommendations, and we look forward to following up. If you have any questions, please do contact us. I believe there is an inbound question email at CBN Network. Kelly and I are happy to be in touch, and we thank you very much for your time tuning into this virtual presentation for 2022 CBE Exchange. For those of you that might be viewing this as well virtually, but who will be in Amelia Island, look very forward to meeting you in person at the conference. Thank you so much.